Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Nathan Gorenstein, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yes, we're on the Break It Down Show. Talk with Nathan. Nathan's an author, and he writes an incredible book about John Browning, who invented all of the modern guns, basically, and all of the ones that work good and everything. And it's just a fantastic. He's one of the greatest American inventors ever, and because of his background in the Old West, and I thought, I need to get my friend Jim DeFelice on here because he knows a lot about this era, especially, at least from my perspective, from his book West Like Lightning, which chronicled the it was sort of like this multi-storied arc that he did for the Pony Express. I don't know if you know this, Nathan, but it was just fantastic, to include Sam Colt and all those guys were all in that book. So thanks for coming on, Jim. Thanks for coming on, Nathan. This is fantastic. I want to start with Jim. Jim, when I brought you this opportunity and you got a chance to read this book, given what your background is and what you've written about, what were your thoughts?
It's a phenomenal book. I knew that, I knew Browning was an incredible inventor. I, had some idea of the debt that we owe to him, but the book, not only does it bring Browning to life, but it really kind of captures a lot of the era, and it's phenomenal. I'm really, really pleased and honored to be on and talk and, just listen. Let's just let Nate talk because, even if he's only a tenth as interesting as his book was or is, it'll be a great time.
Nathan, he's right. Your book is fantastic. I had no idea. I mean, but you don't know until you get into it, and you did it. And it seems like you went through the letters and all of that stuff. How much of a treat was this for you to write?
It was, I was a journalist for my entire career, and there were stories that get better as you report them, and there were stories that get less interesting. And this was one of the stories that got more and more interesting as it went on. I kept finding more intriguing and more previously unknown details. The issue I had in terms of writing was that Browning's inventions are hard to describe chronologically because he invents something, say the semi-automatic pistol, in 1894, 1896 period, yet it doesn't come to fruition in America, at least really, until the 1911. And so you have to write something that happened this decade but doesn't impact for 20 years later. So how do you mix all that up and make it so it reads well? And that was, I can't tell you how I solved it, sort of the mystery of writing, but I trucked on and I came up with a way to cross-pollinate the chapters. So if I'm writing about Browning in 1900, I can talk about what happened with his BAR in 1917. And that was the most interesting, that was the hardest element to in the writing.
How long did it take you to do the research on that? Because it's very extensive. You've got a lot of notes in the back, so obviously a lot of work went into it.
Yeah, I probably spent off and on about a year writing the proposal. I went through 3 different versions of a proposal and doing the original research, the initial research, so I knew enough to write a proposal. And then around that same time that I finished the proposal, I went out to Utah for the first time and had the fortunate, very useful moment to get hooked up with members of the Browning family. And that gave me access a couple of months later to 40 boxes of records in the basement of the now late Bruce Browning, which is really too bad. He was John's last, one of his last grandchildren. And he really wanted a book done, and he made sure I got access to the papers in advance of their being accessible to the public. And they may still not be, actually. They're at Weber State University now. And that really supercharged the book I had. because no one had ever seen these things before. No one ever really knew they existed. And while a chunk of that documentation has to do with post-Browning's death financial and contractual elements with what became the Browning Arms Company, there is a significant amount of material from, say, 1890 through Browning's death in 1956, which was really quite remarkable. And then the other two previously unknown sources of material were the FN company documents. I spent a week in Liège, Belgium. FN people were very nice. A lot of their material had been destroyed in 2 wars, but they did a search of their archives and came up with some really interesting memos from the 1920s and World War I era that give you a sense of how they saw Browning, what it was like for them to deal with them business-wise. And those were very, very helpful. And last but not least, by no means these were, it's funny, you find little hints of things when you're reporting. And at one point I found a mention in another book of a patent dispute between Browning and Luger. And that's all, it's a patent dispute. Well, I knew from being a reporter that there's a lot of legal paper sitting somewhere. So long story short, thanks to the internet, you can look in all these legal journals now, and I found that there was a patent case, and I tracked down the documents from the case, which were in 2 different archives, one in Kansas City, one in New York City, and I got those documents, and in them are 2 depositions by Browning, his brother Matt, who was very important, and brother Ed. And for the first time, we hear their voices. You know, Browning never gave a formal interview. He makes some comments on occasion, but never sat down to talk about what he did. And he had no papers in terms of gun making. He never used blueprints. So to hear he and his brothers and other people talk about, this is how we did things, this is our relationship, this is this and that, it was really quite amazing. And that helped flesh out a chunk of the book and a chunk of Browning's history that no one ever knew. I'll go on in that sphere for a little bit. I'm forcing the people at some firearms museums to rewrite the labels on their exhibits, because if you go to Cody, which is a great place, they have a large collection of the many, many prototypes Browning sold to Winchester, but Winchester never made. And they're beautiful pieces of machine work. Well, it turns out that Browning didn't do much of that. It was mostly done by his half-brother, Ed. Browning would stand over him and tell him what to do, and they were all Browning's inventions, but the actual mechanical work was done by another guy. And you can't minimize his contribution, because if you're sitting with someone and you're making something, there's an interchange of thoughts and ideas. You're not just a automaton. So I'm sure Ed was his name, had some input into, well, this didn't work, John, what do you want to do next? And John probably, listened if Ed had a suggestion.
We should, for people who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, maybe we should give a little bit of background, or you should give a little bit of background on, on the family, the connection with Mormonism, and just to kind of whet their appetite on
Sure.
that.
Sure. So the Browning family, Browning's father, Jonathan Browning, the names are confusing because there's too many Johns and Jonathans in the family, was from Tennessee originally. He converted to Mormonism around 1840, and by 1852, he had moved his first family of about 10 kids to Utah and settled in the Ogden area. The Mormon faith at that point allowed plural marriages. So Jonathan, who was in his 40s, married a woman in her 30s who was John Browning's mother, and also the mother of his brother, Matthew, who plays a big role in Browning's life. And they were the only 2 surviving children from that marriage. But shortly thereafter, Jonathan, the father, married a 3rd woman, and had, I think, don't hold me to this, I'm going to say six kids with that third wife. And a number of those brothers, and those two families from the second and third wives were very close. And a number of those brothers went into the gunsmithing, sporting goods business that Matthew set up. But one of them, Ed, became a machinist. And over time, I'm going to guess over the first 10 years or so of Browning's career, he took on more and more machining work. What Browning really wanted to do was invent stuff. You know, he famously invented his first rifle, and he didn't know what to do with it, so he made a factory in Utah with his brothers from these from two marriages, and they made about 600 rifles. But he didn't really want to do that. I mean, Browning was he was a genius, and he didn't want to be stuck in churning out one rifle after the other. And so he was freed from that when Winchester purchased the patent for his first rifle, the famous 1885 single shot, which has been made in huge variety of calibers over the years. And they stopped making guns. Browning went on to design things.
How did you come across Browning as a story? I mean, obviously he's this pillar of invention and a genius, but something drew your attention to him, and you realized, I mean, as a reporter, you realize there's something there, right? And then
Right.
then it happened to be more than something there. There continue to be things, but how did you get to Browning in the first place?
Well, I finished my first book, and I was looking around for a second book to do, and a couple of folks, one of them is related, a former police officer, retired police officer, was related to Wyatt Earp, and he was suggesting Western stuff. And I was looking around, and I came across the Wyoming Cowboy Wars, and I needed to know something about firearms for that. And I started researching firearms, and I went down an internet rabbit hole essentially. And I knew, again, like a lot of people, I knew who Browning was, and I became so intrigued by all the things he had done. I went looking for a book that would explain to me how he did it, and there really wasn't one. There is and it was useful to me that the one book that is out there, it was written by one of his sons in the 1950s, and it was issued in an abridged version in the 1960s. And a lot of it, I have to say, he did it in a way that ended up fictionalizing a lot because he makes up conversations. And the problem with that is, while the underlying story may be true, when you have the fellow making up the words, it sort of lessens the usefulness of it. That being said, it's the only document we have about Browning's early life, say up until his 20s. And it was very helpful. And the family, very nicely, gave me the unexpurgated manuscript. And there's a lot of good stuff in the unexpurgated manuscript, which is actually pretty reliable in terms of anecdotes that the author would have heard from his father or his uncles directly. And that was very helpful. So that's how it was just like, who is this guy? He did all this stuff, and no one's ever done a book explaining his impact. That was like, that sounds like a book. So I did.
One of the, for me, one of the most interesting things about the book was how you were talking about his creativity. It was almost like, Browning thought in metal. It was, he could, see and do things. Maybe if you talk a little bit about Browning and maybe the era that he was in.
Yeah. So Browning had a couple of advantages. Let me try and do this in order, and I'll talk about his era first, because that allowed him to make use of his innate talents. He grew up at a time when there was a burst of improvement in chemistry, metallurgy, machinery, machine tools, commerce, communications. Don't forget, when he was born, he was in the middle of nowhere without even a telegraph. And so all those technologies allowed or were fueled to the great imaginative burst in America in the late 1800s and Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Edison, the Wright brothers, the telephone, the airplane, electric light, all those sorts of things. So Browning what Browning brought to the table and what allowed him to make use of those technological advances was his two things. One, he grew up from a very young age working on firearms and fixing them. So he had sort of had a master's course in what could go wrong with a gun and what worked and what didn't work.
Right, because his father had been a gunsmith.
Right. His father had been a gunsmith, and John had worked in that shop from a very early age, probably around 5, doing everything from cleaning up to eventually doing repairs himself. And he made his first sort of a crude shotgun at age 10. And it worked. He killed 3 grouse and fed his father breakfast. And his father complained. He said, you're 10 years old. This is the only thing you can make, this schlocky gun. And it was, his father was sort of a goad to John to do better. So Browning had this ability, and I don't know when he discovered it, to think in 3 dimensions. And the example I use is a Rubik's Cube, where, it's 6 sides and 54 colored little cubes. You have to rotate this so everything lines up. Well, Browning could do that in his head. And Browning could have done a couple of them at the same time in his head because he had this unique ability to see things working. So, when we pack a suitcase, we're using spatial memory or spatial rotation is another element of it, to put things in a space. And the shirt will fit here, the pants will fit there, or when we read a map, we're using the same skill. But Browning could do that in 3 dimensions, and he could actually see the mechanisms working in his head. And that was, other people have that skill. Einstein had it. A lot of great, Tesla probably had it. And I'm not sure everyone knew what it was because it really didn't get studied until the mid 20th century. But that was his great skill. His granddaughter told me a great anecdote of when Browning would come visit his sister-in-law. He'd come in at night, he'd sit in a chair and he'd go like this and just sit and think and tap his head. And it would drove her mother crazy. That was Browning thinking. He could see these things in his mind. And it wasn't quick. I mean, it wasn't like a computer. It was a slow process. But in the end result was, once he knew what he wanted to do, he would go and with his brother Ed, they'd make templates. Browning would make sure everything fit together out of sheet metal or cardboard, and then they'd start machining things, and they'd machine it piece by piece and put the thing together.
That kind of genius is incredible. It reminded me a lot of Mozart, who, like, everybody like, hey, we need to hurry up with this performance. He's like, it's all up in my head. I just need to write it out.
It's a really good.
And so there are people that think that. I mean, obviously his is musical, but I bet it's the same kind of genius, like the same variety, whether it's spatial or whatever it is.
I'm sure it's right. Yeah, really good point. Anybody
else like that comes to mind besides Einstein or Tesla and any of these guys?
There was the fellow that invented the steam engine, whose name suddenly escapes me, who I talk about in the book, because he wrote down how he was walking through a park in the UK trying to figure out how to make his steam engine work. And he says, it suddenly came to me. I saw it all in my mind. And that was a similar moment for him. And I think it, I don't know how much it's used these days, because Bruce Browning, he was 91, but he was very sharp. Physically, he wasn't great, but mentally, he was very sharp. He had experienced that. And he tells an interesting story. He says when he was a firearms designer and designed bicycles. And he's talked about how when he first started inventing things, he could see all these things moving in his mind, and they would slowly fit. And then he said he lost that skill when he started using computer-aided design.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because we are the world we live in. To what extent have we lost, or have people lost, certain abilities that may have been inherent or native, but they no longer have to use? Like a blind person will have hearing that we can't conceive of, because they have to do that. So I'd love to see someone analyze that. I mean, spatial thinking is still used today, and people realize how important it is, particularly in computing. but I wonder whether, and I don't know enough. But I wonder whether you lose things when your mind no longer has to do the task. But that's another book. Someone else can write that.
Yeah. And another thing that, again, this comes up in the book again and again, he's able to make use of, just the developments that are going on. As you were saying, this is an era of a lot of things happening, a lot of inventions. One of the key things I think, or that I kind of got was, going from black powder to, I don't know, not to get too technical, but to get from black powder to, to smokeless. Do they light up? Well, maybe you should talk about why that's important. But
so essential smokeless powder essentially allowed Browning and other inventors to make semi-automatic and automatic practical, because smokeless powder, black powder, the formula is set, and the amount of energy that comes out of it is really not amenable to being increased or decreased out of a particular volume. And it's also very dirty. And the residue from exploding black powder is hygroscopic. It will absorb water and create rust. That's a lot of reasons why a lot of early firearms are all pitted. It's because the black powder accelerated the rust process. And so that's also why I'll hold up something here. This is a 4570 cartridge, and it's really big, yet it's no more powerful in a lot of ways. Well, a little more powerful, but the 45 ACP with smokeless powder. So the reason why those old cartridges got so large was because the black powder, you couldn't manipulate the energy in the black powder. It was what it was. So if you wanted higher velocity, you just kept jamming and more, making the cartridges larger and larger.
Bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
I say these words because we live in a ridiculous time. Nathan's going to show us some bullets and potentially some guns, and these are meant for the purposes of illustration. This is nothing more than that. He's talking about a historical figure and his work. If I don't say these things, I swear to God, the robot will hear the word gun, and then all of a sudden we'll have problems. So I want the video to get out to a lot of people. So I just wanted to take the time to say that. But
appreciate
that. And along those lines, and then not to interrupt, but I am interrupting. So along those lines, and the great thing that comes out of Nate's book is that we're talking about guns and weapons, and obviously they're important in that field, but it's also a metaphor for everything that's going on in the society and the culture, as it develops. So, as I was reading it, I'm seeing all these applications outside of that. So I think that, that was one thing that interested me, just because, yes, his medium happens to be, weapons, but he's really talking about, America and the West really at that time.
Yeah. So you're right. When smokeless powder came, Browning could suddenly apply. He had a larger palette to work on, to use a hopefully metaphor. He could, at the same time, because smokeless powder it's much more powerful in a smaller volume, and can be manipulated to burn faster, burn slower, and it's a much more useful propulsive power for a firearm. And because it's much cleaner and doesn't promote rust, you could start making very finely machined machines. And that was also because of modern machinery and modern steel. When the famous 1894 30-30 Winchester came out, the first year it used black cartridges and black powder cartridges. The reason why was that they couldn't figure out how to drill a metal barrel with nickel steel that was powerful enough for a smokeless cartridge, because it was a new metal and it was hard to work. And Winchester figured out how to do it. And the next year they started producing the Winchester 1894 lever action rifle, the most popular deer hunting rifle in America, but it with the famous 30 cartridge, because they now had a barrel that could handle it. I want to add that Browning's designs were so good that they didn't have to be, his rifle designs never had to be revised to handle smokeless cartridge. They were powerful enough. The barrels had to be improved but the basic mechanical design of his actions have withstood the test of time. And so it also allowed him to make his first machine gun. It was a gas-powered weapon, and he was the first one to make a gas-powered firearm. He wasn't the first one to imagine it, or think, well, we could do this with the hot expanding gas from gunpowder. But he made one in 1889, and there's a great account of that. The only account we have of Browning working in his workshop comes from a friend who got into the shop and wrote about the local newspaper. And he writes about seeing what he calls an automatic rifle in 1889 working in Browning's shop. And that becomes Browning, it's funny, he could have invented what we know as an automatic rifle back then, but the market wanted a tripod-mounted machine gun. So he made, to compete with Maxim, who had recoil-operated machine guns. So Browning made his gas-operated tripod-mounted machine gun that Colt started making in 1895. And the reason why that could work was because it had smokeless powder. And you could fire, as many shots. I mean, the test for that is amazing. Browning fires 6,000 rounds in a row. You can never do that with black powder. So
he almost didn't make it with that his prototype either, which is a really interesting story.
Yeah, I mean, this was an air-cooled firearm, and that was, I think, one of its drawbacks at that time was that it was hard to train people to use these machines. Don't forget, we're familiar with this stuff. Back in the day, this was like, what? What is this? No one knew what it was. All the intuitive things we bring to the table when we make a firearm, they didn't know these things. So people would look at this gun and have no idea what to do with it. I mean, you pull the trigger, yeah, but what do you do after that or before that? And so it was a training issue for it through World War I to teach people how to use these firearms. And his first machine gun, they had trouble with it. It worked well for Browning. It didn't work well for American troops. It was interesting. The British used them in the Boer War, and they loved them. And I wonder whether that wasn't because the Brits had more of a standing army and gave training in the guns than the American army did, which was so small back then.
I wanted to go back and you cover quite a bit of this in the story, but because there's so much inventing, gunpowder changes completely, and that's a completely separate entity that does that, that comes up with it and makes it. You have Winchester improving the metallurgy of their barrels and all these different things, but John Browning is able to synthesize all this stuff into these products and to see into the future, to see automatic rifles and semi-automatic shotguns and all these things. There's so much inventing going on in this time. How did they all not to spend their entire lives and fortunes in court trying to battle everybody?
Well, they sometimes did. The book talks about, which is something else no one has ever written about, ever actually. And there was Browning and George Luger, the guy that invented the Luger pistol, and I don't have one to show you, unfortunately, spent 8 years in a patent battle. And the thing that's most fascinating is that it turns out that Browning was the first person to use, and probably, he may have invented, that gets complicated patent course, but certainly was the first person to ever use a major element of the Luger pistol. So one of the things that makes a Luger pistol a Luger was first used in a firearm by Browning. And that's why Luger took him to court, because Luger in 1890 once introduced his pistol to America, and he panics when he finds out that there's a patent applied for by Browning that uses one of the two key elements in Luger's pistol. And Luger's has these images of, I can't sell my gun in America, which is what he wanted. The letters show that from the lawyers. So Luger says, I'm going to file suit against you. I'm going to get a patent declaration that you stole from me. And I have to say, the Luger people concoct this amazing story. And it's a good chapter in the book, just from the terms of storytelling.
Yeah.
They're on a ship together. Browning has a conversation with this guy. Browning steals the idea, goes back to Utah, makes what weapon actually with the same kind of action as Luger. And he stole the gun, and it was all BS essentially. I mean, there was a ship voyage, but that's part of it that's true. And Luger, picked the wrong guy to pick on. Browning was sort of he was a modest guy. He didn't boast, but he was very proud of what he did. And the fact that this guy from Germany would come over and accuse him of stealing an idea was just, I got to use King's English here, but it was outrageous. So when Luger came to Browning and said, look, just settled, Luger essentially admits it was Browning's idea, all but admits that. And I just want the right to sell my guns in America. But what Browning, I have a letter from Browning's lawyer to Browning saying, this is what Luger wants, but you don't want this because you want to keep them out of the market, which is what Browning wanted. He and Colt didn't want Luger sold in America because they would cut into their semi-automatic. So they spent 8 years in court. Ultimately, the court ruled that no one can get a patent on this little device because it was used in other ways earlier, and there was enough of it, enough of the concept existed that it couldn't be patentable. So Luger, the court says Luger can sell his guns in America, and Luger takes out these letters in newspapers saying, "We beat Browning and Colt. We can sell our guns in America." But it was, and there were some other patent excuses, but patent suits, and a lot of these guys did end up in court. But Browning, I think he was so inventive, and you couldn't, people couldn't challenge him. His ideas were original, like the slide action pistol. Browning invented that. So the slide action tilting barrel pistol that 1911 and virtually every other semi-automatic pistol in the world today uses that mechanism or element of it. And no one came up with anything else. I mean, you couldn't challenge it because Browning's idea. I'm going to hold up the first European-made FN 1900, and this is, you can see the machinery. It's a cruder piece of machinery. The nice the machine, the design. So nowadays, all this is a single piece of machine metal, and these days they had to do it in pieces and assemble it. But what you have is the slide, and inside the slide is the block and the firing pin, and it all moves together. And it was Browning who came up with that idea, and that becomes the surviving mechanism. A lot of people have a lot of ideas back then on how to make a pistol, but this is the one that withstood the test of time. And this one was made in 2008 in Liège, Belgium, the Herstal, and it sold 700,000 or so before it went on a production to be replaced in 1910 by a more elegant design. And that because machining had improved, this gets into a very sort of elegant piece of machining. I don't have one here to show you, unfortunately. I should have brought it up. And these pistols, again, this is common to us. In Europe, these were explosive. It was like the iPhone. What is this thing? I mean, people had never seen anything like it. It was very unlike a revolver that we've seen. It's a machine that moves in your hand. I'll just, if I may, got to use my right hand for this. The slide goes, it's an old gun. The slide goes back, thing goes forward, a little shell gets ejected out the side, and it's a machine. It's like this little thing exploding in your hand, and that was a problem in Europe because people didn't realize how deadly they were. I mean, we're imbued with gun safety now. Well, back then, I don't know, like this great thing, let's go shoot some, and it was a real problem in Europe because folks didn't have. Folks don't think about what happens with a bullet that goes for a mile. They might have hit the bird on fire, but meanwhile, and that became a big issue in Europe. But by 1914, Browning has sold 1.25 million semi-automatic handguns in Europe, which sort of works out to one every 300 or so in Western Europe. And it was, and again, it was a new technology. People had never seen it before, and it's fun. Shooting is loud, but it's fun. And that was as a quick aside, Americans didn't like semi-automatic pistols. If you look at the production numbers, Colt sells many fewer than FN in Europe because Americans like revolvers. And that doesn't really change until, the plastic guns of the 1980s, 1990s.
We should mention, or you should actually mention, the relationship of Colt, Winchester, and FN. They are obviously different companies, and Browning had worked with all of them.
Yeah. So if I can use this to try and answer a question that lots of folks ask, which is how much money did he make? Because everyone always comes to that question. And what was his business relationships like? Because Browning was a very serious businessman. If you read the letters we have, he's always on the lookout for investment. He's always telling his sons, don't waste time, take care of business. And his brother Matthew was a very successful businessman in Utah. He invested the brothers' money in banks and utility companies. And the Browning fortune is partly from the royalties and payments, but also partly from Matthew's business acumen. Matthew was a very smart guy. So what happened?
I want to ask too, because it seems like usually the John Browning of the world gets screwed over by the machine because they don't have a Matt Browning next to him. So like Philo Farnsworth or Michael Faraday, who invents there's Faraday cages all around us all the time, but they didn't have a Matthew Browning next to him.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really good point. There's a famous letter from the guy from Colt, Winchester, complaining about Matthew as being a sort of a SOB. And Matthew probably was. But Matthew was the guy, John wasn't as hard-edged in negotiations as Matthew was, is what comes through in the letters. He was serious about business, and because their father, who was an entrepreneur but not particularly successful economically, they were very aware of their relative poverty in Utah. The father, for example, was hugely in debt when he died, and it took his we're getting off subject here, but his estate was in court for 10 or 20 years after his death. But what happened was Browning, again, you have to understand these two guys, Browning and Matt, his brother, are from middle of nowhere, Utah. And 1883, all of a sudden, Winchester shows up and writes him a big check for the gun. And it's like, whoa. And John's reaction is, well, I don't have to work anymore. I mean, I don't have to make things anymore. I can just invent things. Yeah. And Matt takes the finances and he opens up, expands the sporting goods operation. And so over the next 10 or 15 years, 10 years or so, over the next 19 years, Browning sells his designs to Winchester outright. He doesn't get royalties. He just gets a check. And actually not even a check. A lot of what Winchester does is goods in kind. They give Matt cut rate goods to sell in his store. So the payment from Winchester isn't even cash. But that changes when they hook up with Colt. Colt gives them, they get royalties from Colt. That's in this is the time span gets really contracted here. He hooks up with Colt first, but the big break for him in terms of inventions and income comes when he gets hooked up with FN. And that's one of the things that the book talks about, that the whole story you read about is wrong. The right story, and I won't, the correct story is that back in when Browning started working for Colt around with Colt, 1893, 94, 95, there was another engineer there by the name of Hart Oberg, who was from Philadelphia, and they became friends. And my theory is they were very different guys, but Berg is one of the only people, I believe, ever to be invited to the Browning home of all the business people that John hung with. And Berg was Jewish and Browning was a Mormon. And I'm guessing that these two guys in what was then a very Yankee upper crust arms industry in Hartford, they were the two outsiders. And John, people don't talk about human nature. So Browning comes to Colt, and all of a sudden he's the big new guy, and he had to have snubbed the noses of a lot of other existing cult people. Who's this guy that comes in and tells us how to do things? So there's human nature working here too. Anyway, these guys become friends. Berg goes back to Europe. Browning invents his 3 pistols. The first is a lock breech thing that Colt wants to develop for the Army. The second is a blowback pistol, which becomes this, which Browning really likes. He likes this little blowback pistol the most. And the third is no one ever made it a sort of the circular thing. It's a sort of John having fun in metal is what that is. But when Colt says, we don't want to build the blowback, Berg says, hey, we'll build it in FN. So John in 1897 takes his gun to Europe and cuts a deal with FN, and FN starts making them. And when Colt sees how popular they are, they stop making them too, though they're not as popular in the States as they were in Europe. But that's how John got hooked up with FN. It was through a friendship, and it wasn't just the story you hear is that he met some guy and he took his gun back to Europe. Well, John Browning wouldn't have given his prototype to some guy he didn't know was going to jump on a boat to Europe. That just doesn't make sense. Give that away. So that's how they got hooked up. And he already had a long-standing relation with FN and had been to Europe half dozen times before he invented the A2 shotgun. And the book also talks about how that really happened. The story told is that it was a dispute of royalties because the Browning brothers now wanted royalties from Winchester. That's not quite true, because Winchester had already promised these guys, signed written contracts, I have copies, promising these guys royalties for a shotgun that never entered production. So it wasn't a question of will they give them royalties. Winchester realized to keep them, they had to. But Browning was angry at Winchester for a whole variety of reasons, and Winchester was angry at Browning. And so when Winchester balked at producing the Auto 5 shotgun, an angry Browning said, well, I'm going to break the relationship. I'm going to go in and ask for more money than they could ever pay me. And when they say no, I'm going to take it to FN. And so it was very done on purpose by Browning because of bad blood that had been building in the relationship over a period of time.
Yeah, no, there's so much there and obviously people should read the book to unpack a lot of that. I just one thing, it was very unusual to be getting royalties, for a gun at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's why Browning was only getting paid a flat fee for his patents from Winchester, and most gun designers worked in-house and worked for the companies that made the guns. But Browning, he was a genius, and he came up with things no one else did, and so he could sort of remain an independent agent and ask for royalties and sell his designs. Before Winchester purchased the original Browning gun, the single-shot rifle, they tried to invent a gun on their own and couldn't. And then they tried to copy Browning's gun without violating the patent and couldn't do that. And only then did they go and buy the gun from Browning. And they didn't want to, they were reliant on this guy in Utah. And they didn't like that. And when the company broke, the head of when the two company and Browning broke up, the Winchester company writes a sort of nasty letter saying, we're going to be better off without them, and they're going to be worse off without us. And neither of those things turned out to be true.
Yeah. How did the Brownings do overall, though? You have Matt there running the business aspect. Did they leave money on the table at all, or were they pretty much good at hitting the mark?
They had. It's hard to know how much they earned totally when in their estates, which were filed in Utah, they both had $300,000-$500,000 at the time of their deaths, which was a significant amount of money back then. But it also is a fraction probably of the accumulated wealth, because they had given money away. They had purchased property. They had given their kids money. So there was whatever fortune they came up with was much larger than what was reported in their wills. But John there's an interesting, after World War II, when they're renegotiating their contracts with FN because of the interruption of the war, Matt and John, to a certain extent too, write very tough letters to Val, telling him, "Don't get taken in by these Belgians." There's a great line Matt writes saying, "They're like children, but they're not. They act like children, but they're not." And you can see from that these guys had their eye on the bottom line, and they were worried. By this time, both of the brothers are in their 60s, early 70s, and are worried that Val is going to get taken advantage of. And Val, actually, which is John Browning's son, the youngest son, goes in the opposite direction. And there were memos by Colt and FN complaining about how hard it is to deal with Val. And Val writes this long memo to Colt that goes on for pages and pages and pages, complaining about how you don't take me seriously, you're trying to rip me off, and it's sort of like a tantrum by Val. But Val is the one though who continues the company. He expands it. After John and Matthew die, Val and his brother Mariner, Matthew's kid, try and set up a manufacturing and importation business, and they do that, and that becomes Browning Firearms, which lasts until it's still around, but it's owned by FN now, as is Winchester. Interestingly enough, both companies are owned by FN.
Can you tell us a little bit about the BAR?
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. That it arrived on the scene in 1917 when the U.S. is entering World War II, World War I, and realizes that it essentially has no automatic weapons, where in Europe there are tens and tens of thousands of them. So if they're going to equip an army, they think they need two kinds of firearms. One is a stationary tripod-mounted machine gun, and one is an automatic weapon that a soldier can carry. And the Europeans had come up with a couple of versions, both of which had serious drawbacks. And so they go to Browning and they say, "Well, what do you have?" And turns out, and again, this isn't a letter in the archives, the story is no one has ever known where it came from. All the accounts at the time and in the by other authors say it sort of shows up in 1917. It actually was invented around 1910, 1912 by Browning and his brother Ed. And they had come up with a working model, but couldn't interest anybody in it. So they put it up on the shelf and went on to other things. John, while he did his military work out of patriotism, he never enjoyed it in terms of, because he liked to be his own boss. When you do military work, you got to deal with generals, procurement people. Everyone has an idea about what you should do. And Browning didn't enjoy that. So you don't want to make it? Fine, I can do other stuff. And he put it up on the shelf until the Army came to him and said, "Hey, we need something." And they took it down. And that's why it showed up so quickly and was so quickly put into production, was because it was more or less already made and already invented on his own. Another interesting thing is that after World War, another memo from in the family's archives, there was after World War I, there was a lot of rethinking about what to do with automatic weapons. And Browning writes in a memo that the Army has it all wrong. They want to invent some sort of automatic pistol. And he says, that's a stupid idea. What you want to do is invent a automatic rifle that uses an interim cartridge. And he gets a patent on one and builds one, which unfortunately is lost. But it's essentially the modern quote unquote assault rifle. And he made one and he couldn't interest anyone in it. And he writes an interesting memo saying this is what the Army needs. This is why they should do this and not what they want to do. And he has a great line in there saying, all these generals are usually wrong. So, yeah, I mean, it's he knew he was, I'm going to go back for a second, if I might, and talk about Browning's not just mechanical genius, but he knew people. Because after he invents this relatively big pistol, in 1905, And he comes up with this. And this is like tiny. And you shoot it with like 2 fingers and a thumb. And first off, for him, it must have been great fun inventing this because it has a grip safety and a thumb safety, and it's a slide action. Slide action. I gotta get the camera. And you can imagine a guy who invents things comes up with this tiny little machine, and it's like a jewel. And FN makes them, and it's it's a huge success. They sell hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them in Europe because it's a pocket accessory. It's modern technology. It's this little thing that people couldn't have imagined before it showed up. But Browning knew that he could do it and knew that people would buy it. And he did have a sense for what the market wanted. These were made in the States too. And it had a longer life. The Belgians started making a simplified version of it without the sort of, this is really a mechanical, expensive thing to make in these days. So after a while, the Belgians started simplifying them. So, and it's really quite fascinating, you know, that he knew what folks wanted. You know, downside is that, understandably and correctly, European governments started getting alarmed because all these people were getting shot and wounded by accident. And it was also becoming used in crime more frequently. There's a great series of studies done in Germany, or studies of Germany in the first decade of the 20th century, that talk about how the country was changing, quoting documents from back then, from the culture of the knife, where an apprentice, new job, goes out and buys stuff, gets a knife for self-protection. Now they go out and they get a Browning pistol. And that changes things because suddenly, you know, and they talk about people not understanding how dangerous they were, and that being a social problem in Germany, and presumably France too. Because if I can tell you another story, this gun, there's a lot of political turmoil in Europe at this time, anarchists and everything, and this gun becomes the favorite gun of all the anarchists in Europe. There's a great article in the London Times around 1907 saying, this is proof of a massive anarchist conspiracy because they're all using the same gun. And they wouldn't all be using the same gun unless there was some mastermind doing it. Well, it was BS. They just picked the best one like everyone else did, you know. That's all there was to it. You know, if you're going to go try and assassinate the prime minister of Spain, you're going to, well, I want a gun that you're going to get the best thing you can. And you could put these in your pocket, shot a 32 caliber round, which was enough for what you wanted to do. And that's why it became the gun of revolutionaries in Europe.
Well, you know, and guns are very controversial, you know, even today, or especially today. And how did you how do you feel about that? And how did you deal with that in writing the book and even selling the book to a publisher?
Oh, that's a complicated question. So there were some, I'll start with the easy part, the publishing side. There are some people didn't want to touch the book because it was about guns. But Simon & Schuster, and I'll give a shout out to Rick Horgan and my agent, Alice Martell. Alice, they saw it for what it was and what it is. It's a piece of unknown history. No matter what you think about guns, they have an enormous impact on the world history. And particularly the advent of automatic weapons. And here's the guy who did it all. And also, a bit of a quick aside, you know, Browning, you can argue Browning won World War II. How do you say that? Well, they dropped the atom bomb in Japan and we bombed Germany into smithereens. But neither of those would have been possible if we couldn't keep our airplanes in the air. And every American fighting aircraft in World War II used Browning's 50 caliber machine gun. Everyone. So, and all the ground units used the VAR, the 30 caliber, the 50 caliber, the 1911, even one of his shotguns. So when we went out and fought in World War II, we were fighting with Browning's guns. And so you couldn't get the B-29 onto Tinian until all those islands were conquered by the Marines and the Army. And they did it with Browning's guns. And we sunk the Japanese fleet at Midway because our fighting aircraft cleared out the Japanese planes with Browning's guns. And so he has a serious historic impact, and I think they saw that. I think there's still resistance to reviewing a book that, quote unquote, is not critical of a gun maker. I mean, I try and approach it neutrally. In the book, I talk about the good things and the bad things that happen with his guns. But I do admire him as an inventor, and he was a great inventor. So, personally, I sort of come down in the middle. I think the Second Amendment right to bear arms. I'm a competitive shooter. I enjoy it. I want to keep doing it with my 21 round magazines, pistols. Yet people also have a right not to get shot.
Yeah.
And so and I'm not going to sit here and tell you what the solution to that is, but there's a legitimate issue raised by the anti-gunners, both by the anti and pro-gunners. And I don't know how to solve it. I wish if I did, maybe I'd be president. But that's my own feeling, is that guns can be good and bad. And the things that make guns bad are not, if there were no guns in the world, maybe the world would be a much better place, but it's not the world we live in. There's always going to be someone inventing a weapon. There's always going to be someone out to get you. I mean, look at human nature. God, we're not always nice people. So firearms and protection are a necessity.
Yeah, humans are pretty crappy at being humane sometimes. And you're right. If not John Browning, maybe the next guy in the chute who invents something even more horrible, or whatever it is.
Well, invent it for the other guy. I'd rather have him invent it for us.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, you think about the island hopping campaigns. The Japanese were fighting a different land war than we were. And I mean, how many stories are there of a machine gun nest full of 3 Marines wiping out hundreds of Japanese because of the way they fought? And then the other version of the story, when we go up to the machine gun nest, we're jamming a flamethrower, like Woody Williams is just barbecuing people.
In fact, the Japanese started copying Brownings guns.
Sure. Killed by him.
As the war went on, they put. Someone might correct me on this, but they copied at least 2. They made at least 2 automatic weapons. One was a 20 millimeter cannon. They upgraded from a 50 caliber machine gun, which America didn't do for some reason. The Japanese did it, and put it in their aircraft. They also made I believe, a equivalent 50 caliber gun that they used from one of Browning's patents. He had a couple of different versions of the M2 were patented, and one of those, and made that. And America tried to copy the German MG42, but they screwed up and dropped it. I think they got metric inch transitions wrong, and the gun wouldn't work, which,
I have another question. It's not really about the book. Everybody should get the book, though. The Guns of John Moses Browning.
It's a quick read. It's a good read. It's not too technical, but just technical enough.
No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. One of the things that's in the book quite a bit is, and as a guy in the Army, I was one of the 60 gunners. We had an old 60, and my philosophy with that gun was, and we were shooting blanks in training. I would fire it until it fell apart. I would drop it on the ground and run up and go forward because it was going to break, right? And there's full of these inadequate weapons. So maybe it gets to a government test, but you use it more than a couple of times. And I mean, our 60 was always broken. It never worked. It'd fix it, it'd come back, and it'd shake itself apart again. It just was, at least ours, was not a good gun, And for all the celebration of the 60 or the AK-47, every AK-47 I've fired has critically failed at some point. I mean, we're like, this thing's now. Granted, a lot of them are garbage because of the way they're made, but
you know what, Pete, this may be you though. I mean, basically, you're telling us that every weapon you touch falls apart. What's the common denominator there?
Interesting. I'll tell you something interesting. The other day on one of the gun blogs, they said that the Army had hired FN to do a run of. I always get my gun numbers wrong. The 240 machine gun, belt-fed machine gun, and that's a Browning automatic rifle turned upside down. Yeah, is what that is, and fed with a belt rather than a magazine. And so even now, and that was more reliable than the M60 by all accounts I've read.
Yes.
And so when the Army has to go buy a new belt-fed squad weapon, they buy that. They buy John Browning's upside-down Browning automatic rifle, made by FN.
I had a Sten, and I was amazed by how simple that was and how reliable. I mean, that thing where I pointed it, it shot straight. It was fantastic. Yeah, it was great. I had an HK MP5 at one point. Fantastic, didn't fail. But what was it so hard? What was so hard for his peers for them to make something reliable? Why were they not able to capture what he was able to capture? Because you can continue to fine tune something, but he just got it right on the first try, or earlier.
Yeah. Right. That's I don't have a good answer for that. I think in part because Browning came up with designs. A couple of pieces to the answer, though. One is his designs were better than the others. Luger had his toggle link action, which is very elegant but not reliable. There was the Mauser with the big, the broom handle Mauser, which was just, I picked one up and I said, how did anyone ever hit anything with this thing? It's just so unergonomic. So he came up with the fundamentally reliable designs. And the best thing I answer is the failings of bureaucracies. Why did and I'll tell you an example about Browning. Browning, the 30 caliber machine gun, water cooled, was actually invented around 1900 and 1910 by Browning. And another one, you couldn't interest anyone in it, and it goes back on the shelf and it sits in the patent office. And the Army instead uses this air cooled gun that is, that make a few 100,000 of them, that actually is a Benet, designed in part by the former head of Army Ordnance, which may be why they got it. And it's a horrible gun. And they must have known this in the test. If you look at the thing, it looks completely complicated and ungainly. Yet they knew of Browning because they had bought his 1895 for the Army. They had his 1911. So when he came in with his much better machine gun, why didn't they adopt it? Inertia of bureaucracy, human nature, maybe cults offended somebody. I think sometimes I wonder how anything ever gets done in this world, because people can be difficult. That was a secret of Browning's success, though. One of the FN guys wrote that Browning never incurred jealousy among the people he worked with. The John Browning rarely did, because he at least in FN he said something to the effect, yeah, everyone can be difficult, but everyone has something to add to the thing. So you look at what they can add that's positive, ignore everything else. And Browning had an ability to do that, which made him a comfortable guy for folks to deal with, and I think contributed to his success and longevity. You'd rather have someone you like rather than someone you like to deal with. So.
Jim, any final thoughts or questions?
No, I think we've talked, I guess, for about an hour about the book and barely scratched the surface. I think anybody that's interested, in certainly in weapons, firearms, but also 19th, 20th, even 21st century, history. It's a great book to pick up.
Thanks, guys.
Any closing thoughts, Nathan?
No, I just hope that people see it. Don't just see it as a book for gun people, because it's really a book about how we got to the world we have now, and the importance of a single man. I don't exaggerate when I say he was a seminal figure in 20th century America. Whether you like guns or not, guns play a big part, and you should know about the people who did that.